In Tuesday's elections, an overwhelming majority of Ohio voters decided that the right to an abortion should be protected by that state's constitution. And in response, the Republican Party of Ohio has publicly declared that they intend to ignore the results of that vote and may even seek to strip the power of the judiciary to enforce it. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. All right, friends, so when people ask me, Josiah, why are you so critical of the Republican Party? Why are you so unapologetically partisan in favor of progressive Democrats? Stuff like this is the reason why, at least one of the reasons. The Republican Party, both at the federal level and apparently the state level, is a bad faith, disloyal, authoritarian cult of personality with no limiting principle. No limiting principle. You give them an inch, they'll take a mile. You actually democratically take that inch away, they'll take 2 miles. It doesn't matter. They don't care about this stuff, okay? It's all about power over principle, overwhelmingly. So to provide some context here, we had Tuesday's vote, right? But before that, we got to wind the clock back even further, back to August. So after the U.S. Supreme Court decided to, overturn Roe v. Wade and send, at least ostensibly, send the question of abortion back to the states, the Republican Party of Ohio, they saw the writing on the wall. They were like, listen, even in red states, the right to an abortion is pretty popular. And in Ohio, citizens have the right to put these questions up to ballot measures, basically referendum, where they can vote directly on the issue. And in Ohio, all it takes to amend the state constitution is a simple majority on a ballot measure like that. So Republicans tried to get ahead of it, and they were like, we'll have a special election to decide whether or not a simple majority should be enough to amend the state constitution. It was a bad faith attempt to preempt the outcome that happened Tuesday. It failed. Ohio voters were like, no, we're not going to raise the threshold to amend the Constitution and take more power away from ourselves and give to you. So it failed, which means that on Tuesday's elections, all you needed was a simple majority. Before I get to that, I will say it was a matter of record that Republicans were openly admitting that this was an attempt to stop the codification of abortion rights into the Ohio state constitution. It's unambiguous. You don't have to read the tea leaves. You don't have to read between the lines. It's simply a matter of fact. So, given that that attempt failed, what happened on Tuesday? Well, as we've discussed in this channel, Ohio Issue 1, the right to codify abortion rights into the state constitution, it passed overwhelmingly. 57% of Ohio voters decided to pass it. Okay, decisive majority compared to 43% of Ohio voters. In response, the Republican leader of the Ohio House, Jason Stephens, said, "The legislature has multiple paths that we will explore to continue to protect innocent life. This is not the end of the conversation." Now, of course, what's hilarious is it should have been the end of the conversation, right? It doesn't get more decisive than a constitutional amendment directly voted upon by the majority of voters. And yet, Ohio Republicans were like, hold my beer, we're not done. So it was reported yesterday in the Cincinnati Enquirer, Ohio Republican lawmakers propose stripping judges of power to interpret abortion rights. Okay? So we will withdraw jurisdiction from the courts so they cannot misapply Issue 1 for the benefit of the abortion industry, said an Ohio Republican lawmaker. The Ohio Speaker, who I just mentioned, Jason Stephens, he was quiet on the issue. He declined to comment on the release or the idea. Okay? Now, a guy named Paul Pfeiffer, who is a Republican and a former Ohio Supreme Court justice, said this is ridiculous. The Supreme Court of Ohio is the final arbiter of constitutional issues, period. There's no getting around that, so legislation that attempts to circumvent the Constitution eventually isn't going to go anywhere. Gabriel Mann, a spokesperson for the Issue 1 campaign, said the idea was more bad behavior from Republican lawmakers, obviously. Issue 1 passed thanks to the votes of a lot of Republicans who do not like the idea of government overstep. They don't want government interference in people's private lives, he said. House Minority Leader Allison Russo, the Democrat, said, instead of creating a constitutional crisis with desperate anti-American attacks on the rule of law and the power of citizens, out-of-touch politicians should work to uphold the bipartisan will of the people by respecting healthcare decisions between women and their doctors. On Wednesday, the same day that this was released, more than 24 House Republicans promised to push back on Issue 1, even though at this point it was a constitutional amendment, publicly decided by referendum. So that was yesterday. Well, what happened today? They released it anyway. They released this announcement, this declaration. Deceptive Ohio Issue 1 misled the public but doesn't repeal our laws, said the Republican caucus of the Ohio House of Representatives. Foreign billionaires don't get to make Ohio laws, said Jennifer Gross. This is foreign election interference and it will not stand. And the sentence begins, Ohio legislators will be introducing several bills to address the issue in the coming weeks. Someone else goes on to say, Issue 1 does not repeal a single Ohio law. In fact, it doesn't even mention one, said Bill Dean. The amendment's language is dangerously vague and unconstrained and can be weaponized to attack parental rights or defend rapists, pedophiles, or human traffickers. Melanie Miller said, we will continue to be a voice for every child in their mother's womb who cannot speak for themselves. And finally, Beth Lear, this is a doozy, says, no amendment can overturn the God-given rights with which we are born. Now, your personal religious convictions or lack thereof may inform your ethics, which may have an indirect relationship to whatever legislation you propose if you are a legislator, but there is a separation of church and state, and your personal religious convictions do not legally supersede the law of the land, let alone your state's constitution, okay? She's clearly a religious zealot. And the article, or excuse me, the declaration concludes, to prevent mischief by pro-abortion courts with Issue 1, Ohio legislators will consider removing jurisdiction from the judiciary over this ambiguous ballot initiative. The Ohio legislature alone will consider what, if any, modifications to make to existing laws based on public hearings and input from legal experts on both sides. So, folks, it's not just an issue with the Republican Party at the federal level. It's not just the likes of Mike Johnson and Mitch McConnell or Donald Trump even. It's elected Republicans even at the state level. There is a fascistic, authoritarian, anti-democratic strain which has just metastasized in this party, and it's manifesting in a variety of ways, even Ohio. It's trickling its way down. The Democratic Party has its faults, to be sure, but nothing like this. It is a loyal Democratic Party. The Republican Party is just approaching comic book villain tier. And this is the other thing that I've said in debates and conversations and in previous videos. You can't take laws for granted. You can't take the Constitution for granted. You can't take tradition for granted. This isn't Harry Potter. This isn't supernatural. These are words written by people, fallible people, in ink on paper, and they're not divinely compelled. They rely on good faith, reciprocal good faith from those in power and those not in power. And what we have here is one of two major political parties who wield a considerable amount of power, especially in Ohio, saying, yeah, I know what it says, and we tried to get around it, and that failed, and the outcome isn't what we wanted, but here it says, it's black and white, and we're just going to say no, just no. And we can come up with all sorts of creative post or ad hoc justifications as to why, but at the end of the day, it's just no. It's like we can't, these words on paper don't magically compel us to do so like it's a fantasy movie. That's where we are. So as we leave rather one set of elections behind in 2023 in which Republicans got walloped, and as we head into another election cycle in 2024, please keep this in mind. It's not enough to just get federal Republicans out of power, but also at the state level too. Elected Republicans can't be trusted. They just can't. They're bad faith. They're disloyal opposition. They're authoritarian. They can't be trusted. They shouldn't be trusted. They have not earned your trust. Because if they're willing to just publicly, brazenly, reject public referendum with decisive majorities, plain as day, black and white, if they're willing to do and say, if they're even willing to seriously entertain, because it's not enough, maybe this will fail. Maybe they'll reconsider. No. The fact that this was even considered, the fact that this was considered so deeply that they made a public declaration of intent about it is enough to disqualify this party from holding power. You let me know what you think in the comments. I think this is gross.